Hi everybody. I just wanted to go over in a quick video some of the things that we didn't get to in today on Wednesday. Um, I'm going to go over the 1.04, 1.05 part and make sure that we have enough to be able to successfully complete that quiz for this week. So the objectives that I had given you were to identify and describe the political boundaries of Eastern Europe and to be able to analyze how the character of Eastern Europe is related to its political, economic, social, and cultural elements. And one of the things that I want you to focus on is everything that isn't a natural barrier or a natural part of the geography of Eastern Europe, and particularly Russia and its surrounding territories. We're going to use words to talk about culture and political elements in Eastern Europe. And remember that when we have our live sessions, I expect you to participate to the best of your ability, to be a good communicator, to be polite, respectful, and courteous, to remain focused and on task. And we're going to keep our personal information out of chat when we're in chat. All right, that's just a reminder. The reminder also that on Thursday, January 27th, we're going to have, you need to have this quiz completed, okay, for Unit 1.04, 1.05. All right. So we had a short video on the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and we covered that in class. The YouTube link is below, so I'm not going to actually play this in the recording, but the YouTube link is below if you wish to view this on Russia and Ukraine. So let's review a little bit about 1.04, and then we'll go on into 1.05, okay? All right, the word Orthodox is defined as meaning strict followers. And today, more than 300 million Christians are members of the Orthodox Church. So more than 300 million people are members of the Orthodox Church. And the Western Christian churches, the Orthodox Church is not in communion or in a relationship, working relationship with the Roman Catholic and Protestant communities. They have split, which is what a schism means. Constantinople, which was over here in Turkey, in the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople was called New Rome because it was the home and the center of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, our economic systems. Private companies, individuals make decisions, promote competition, and companies earn profit. That describes a market economy. This is usually associated with a democracy. The system that is also known as communism or socialism has government committees that make decisions about all aspects of business and minimal consumer choice. This is a command economy. Remember that communism and socialism are economic systems, but communism often comes with authoritarian aspects of its politics. Socialism is closer to market economy, but in this case, it allows private ownership by the companies and the people within the country. However, it is still one that redistributes wealth. in a true communist nation, there is no private wealth. Okay, and lastly, the decision based on tradition, belief, and culture that is passed down from generations. As an example, the African tribes, the Inuit tribe in Canada, and Aborigines in places like Australia would be the traditional economy. Please do not get economic systems mixed up with political systems. Just because a country is authoritarian does not make it communist. Just because a country is democratic does not necessarily make it a market economy. So, when you hear the word communism, what do you think? Do you think of the political side of authoritarianism, or do you think of the economic side of collectivism where everybody contributes and everybody receives the benefits? So, a command economy is where the government controls the resources, allocates or assigns the resources, and it uses commands to regulate the use of the resources. There is no private ownership in a true communist or command society. Almost 2 decades after the fall of communism, back in the 1980s and 90s, several countries were still struggling to establish stable democracies. Notice that's in yellow. You're going to need it for your quiz. These young democracies would struggle to move away from communism and command economies because their governments were young, untested, and corrupted. The European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, or the EBRD, was established in 1991 to help with the transition towards that market-based economy and to promote private and entrepreneurial, meaning individuals seek to make money, economies, and to promote private and entrepreneurial initiative in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, where they had not experienced this kind of economy in probably 100 years. So Russian economics, and politics. So Tsar Nicholas, the guy in the middle, was the last Tsar of the Russian Empire until 1917, when the empire was overthrown. So we need to understand what the Tsars and basically of the Russian government were doing. Lenin was the first head of the Soviet state in 1917. He masterminded the Bolshevik takeover of power in Russia, and then that led to the Russian Revolution of 1917. He was the architect and the first head of state in the Soviet Union, the USSR, United Socialist Soviet Republic. When his efforts to transform the Russian economy to socialist models stalled, he introduced the new economic policy where a measure of private enterprise was still permitted. This was a policy that continued for several years after his death, but the workers were Lenin's target audience, and he wanted to keep them happy. And it allowed for some private enterprise. The workers were Lenin's, they were what he focused on. So Vladimir Lenin masterminded the Bolshevik takeover. In 1917, he was the designer and first head of the Soviet state. When changing the Russian economic model into a socialist model, this became hard to do. He introduced this new economic policy that allowed for some private ownership. Joseph Stalin was the successor to Lenin. But he was ruthless and ambitious, and he grabbed control of the Soviet Union after the death of Vladimir Lenin in 1924. He came up with a 5-year plan, a series of 5-year plans. These were plans to modernize the economy to keep up with the West and to modernize Russia. The first 2 plans concentrated on improving heavy industry, coal, oil, steel, and electricity. Each plan set a target which industries had to meet. Each factory was set a target that it had to accomplish, and these targets were completely unrealistic. Although no factory could reach its goal, the 5-year plans did lead to increased outputs and some economic growth. At the same time, many of the workers were slave workers and kulaks, which were wealthy farming peasants that did not like collectivism. From the Gulag, which was a Russian labor prison, strikers were shot, wreckers, slow workers could be executed or imprisoned. Thousands died from accidents, starvation, or cold. Housing and wages were terrible, and no consumer goods were produced for the people. This was all about meeting these arbitrary targets, and if you didn't meet the arbitrary target, you were killed or put in prison, which would end up leading to your death anyway, because the prisons were all in Siberia, in far eastern Russia, and in the Asian continent. Okay, so after Lenin's death, Stalin took control of the Soviet Union. So what happened in the Balkans? Ethnicity is based not on your actual race in the Balkans, but rather on your religion combined with your race. The Serbs make up a very large part of the population of the Balkan Peninsula. Although the Serbs were the minority, they also had the power of the Federal Army on their sides. With the help of the Federal Army and the approval of the government under Slobodan Milosevic, 2 million people were driven from their homes and at least 20,000 people were killed. During the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, tens of thousands of Bosnian Muslims were killed or forced to run. Milosevic was charged with 66 counts of crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes. He was arrested and detained at the UN Center near The Hague on the Netherlands in 2001. He died in prison in 2006. He faced 66 counts of crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes that were committed during the years of the Balkan War in the 1990s, in which tens of thousands of these Bosnian Muslims targeted were killed or forced to flee. So this was more Christian versus Muslim than it was white, black, brown. It wasn't about race. It was about culture, language, and mostly religion. Many people believe that the United States and the European community should be ashamed for the way that they allowed the crimes against humanity to be perpetrated in this region for so many years. At the outset of the conflict, both the U.S. and the European Union stood firmly on the side of Yugoslavia, because Yugoslavia, the interesting thing about Yugoslavia was that it was more progressive in terms of its economics, more market-based than was a lot of the rest of the Eastern Bloc. Where were the Balkan Wars held? The war crime trials were held at The Hague, Netherlands. Okay. So rivalries between Serb, Croat, and Muslim communities date back centuries. That is true. Slobodan Milosevic became the first sitting head of state to have charges brought against him by the UN for war crimes, and those trials were held in the UN Center near The Hague in the Netherlands. All right. During the Cold War period, which lasted from the 1940s until the end of the 1980s, international politics were heavily shaped by the intense rivalry between these two great blocks of power and the political ideologies that they represented. Democracy and capitalism in the case of the United States and its allies, and communism in the case of the Soviet bloc. The term Cold War, the US and the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, were at the point of war without there being an actual war. Lippmann, the journalist who coined the term Cold War, meant that relations between the USSR and World War II allies, primarily the US, Britain, and France, had deteriorated to the point of war without the occurrence of actual warfare. This is the time we were worried about one thing happening, and that was somebody dropping a nuclear bomb, because the United States and Russia, the two superpowers, or the Soviet Union, had access to the bomb by the 1950s. On the Soviet side were many of the countries of Eastern Europe, including Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, East Germany, and Romania, and during parts of the Cold War, Cuba and China. These countries were not an ally of the USSR during the Cold War, like West Germany. East Germany was taken over after the World War II ended. When the Berlin Wall was erected in September 1961 to prevent the outflow of skilled manpower from the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, the wall came down in 1989, so it lasted from 1961 to 1989, roughly 28 years. It also brought down communism and the threat of the Cold War when the wall came down, freeing not only Germans from continual fear, but the rest of the world as well. International implications for this wall, the fall of the Berlin Wall, were that it signified the end of the Cold War. So remember, Berlin Wall, built in September 1961, was built to prevent the outflow of skilled manpower from the German Democratic Republic, divides Eastern and Western Germany and Eastern and Western Europe into a Western bloc and an Eastern bloc. When the wall came down in 1989, it symbolized the end of communism and the Cold War. By summer of 1990, all of the Eastern European countries had their own governments. Many of these countries are at an increased risk of turmoil during global recessions due to the government corruption that still exists in those countries. So what is this, everybody? This is a nuclear power plant, right? This is a nuclear power plant, and the one we're very interested in looking at right now in terms of historical influence was Chernobyl, which was in the Ukraine. As of February 2009, 30 countries worldwide were operating 436 nuclear reactors for producing electricity, and 44 new nuclear plants were under construction in 14 different countries. The next generation of nuclear power plants being built in places like California and South Africa are even safer and more efficient than those currently in operation. In 2007, nuclear power plants provided about 14% of the world's electricity. Nuclear power plants generate heat from fission rather than burning fuel, so they produce no greenhouse gases or emissions associated with acid rain or urban smog. In the U.S., approximately 20% of the nation's power is provided by nuclear energy, so it has good points and bad points. In the 1980s, because of concern over imported oil, France more than tripled its nuclear energy production. During that period of time, total pollution from the French electric power system dropped by 80 to 90%. So there's a lot of people that have confusion about the safety and effectiveness of nuclear energy, when in reality, oftentimes nuclear energy actually benefits the environment rather than threatens, if it's done right. Eastern Europe uses nuclear energy for electricity production at a higher proportion compared to other parts of the world. And you can see here the amount of nuclear power generated in 2019. Believe it or not, the United States leads at the top, and then France behind it, and then China, and then Russia. Okay? So there's good parts and bad parts, and that's what you need to know when you get to your part 2 of the unit exam for unit 1.06. All right, so there are pros and cons to nuclear energy. The pros: nuclear energy is clean. There are no greenhouse gas emissions. France saw 80 to 90% reduction in its pollution when it switched to nuclear. It is less expensive than traditional energy sources. It uses mined uranium instead of coal, oil, or gas. The nuclear power plants can generate continuously long-term power demands from large areas. The cons are that the greatest danger from an accident at a nuclear power plant is exposure to radiation, which is a big concern because once you expose all that to radiation, there's no going back. Concerns over long-term disposal of radioactive waste are definitely a consideration. Nuclear waste remains active for hundreds of years, so it's very hard to clean up. Threats from terrorist groups who could gain nuclear components are also something that's a con. Stockpiling nuclear materials to use in wars rather than to use for the purpose of energy is something that must be considered. Possible catastrophic damage to nuclear reactors from natural disasters. So there's two sides to this argument that you can make. One is you can say, you know what? Let's use it more. It works. It's cheap. It works. And it benefits society. Another says, nope, because of the risks involved. Because if something goes wrong, it's hundreds of years before you can even consider cleaning it up. The worst case scenario did happen in the 1980s. The largest nuclear accident to date occurred in Chernobyl in the Ukraine, which in 1986 was controlled by the Soviet Union. A power surge destroyed a unit that had been poorly designed, resulting in tremendous explosion and release of radioactive material, and a fire ripped apart the casing of the core, exposing the core, and that released radioactive isotopes into the atmosphere. 31 people died as an immediate result, and the estimated number of dead as a secondary result is 15,000 more in the surrounding area after exposure to the radiation. The area surrounding Chernobyl was evacuated and remains vacant to this very day, although authorized limited trips for short periods of time are allowed by the Ukrainian government, but it still is no place you want to go to for more than a little while. You may not have time to share it. All right. We want to make sure that that we understand the impact of Chernobyl because it's something that we can learn from. You can see over here on the left-hand side what happened to the plant itself. If things go wrong or the plant is designed poorly, then any benefits are negated because you can expose people for hundreds of years. All right, structures that are built on permafrost. Remember what permafrost is? It is found in the tundra, and it is soil that is constantly freezing. It has ice in it. So although permafrost can extend hundreds of feet deep, it is really only the top section that is a concern. The heat from buildings melts the ice in the permafrost below, and the water is then displaced. Failures in building construction in permafrost regions can result in mistakes in site evaluation or in construction design and poor maintenance, and then you get this. So the heat from the buildings melts the ice in the permafrost below, especially in times right now of global warming, and the water is then displaced, and anything built on top of the permafrost will sink like this is. So the ways to deal with permafrost: avoid it, destroy it, or preserve it. Don't melt it. And so the risk right now is of melting permafrost because of global warming. So tourism. Tourism provides an economic gain. Since the fall of communism in the early 1990s, many Eastern European countries have been spending large amounts of money to develop first-class winter resorts, especially in the northern parts of Eastern Europe. Two best ski resorts in Eastern Europe are Bansko in Bulgaria and Jasna in Slovakia. Substantially cheaper to ski, it is substantially cheaper to ski in Eastern Europe. Bulgaria claims to have the most modern resort in Eastern Europe. Slovakia has also taken advantage of its many thermal springs by providing or building spas and wellness centers and over-the-top water parks. Okay, what would it be like for you in Eastern Europe? What would it be like for you in Eastern Europe? If you're going to school in Eastern Europe, you're assigned a school based on your exam scores. The people going to the better schools aren't going there because of where they live or how much money they're making. It's their exam scores. Many Eastern European countries are facing a generational crisis. Young people are fleeing because they cannot find adequate paying jobs, leaving behind an aging population that will need more and more governmental services. In urban cities, there's more pressure to succeed in school and in the job market. A lack of jobs is encouraging students to sometimes choose the wrong path because of the potential to make a lot of money, like cyber hacking and basically Eastern versions of mafia-style gangs. Crime. Okay, so that was a lot. So I hope you're feeling that you got this. And if you're feeling then you might want to ask a few questions or go back and read again. And if you're feeling like this, help, let me know and I'll do my best to help you. And remember, we do have open office hours on Thursdays, and periodically, especially before a test, we will have review sessions. Okay, there's a Blooket that I gave you guys in class. It is at this link, www.blooket.com/play, ID equal 127463. And this is basically a quiz that you can use to practice. All right, just a reminder, you should have already read sections 102 and 103. Make sure you read 104 and 105. Remember that on Thursday, the 27th of January, your 104, 105 was due, and zeros go in the following Monday. So make sure you use your notes to help you, and you have 3 attempts on all quizzes. Okay, questions? Let me know by email. And I want you guys to have a great day.